Hi again. In Kenneth Latourette, A History of Christianity, we're in Chapter 8 now, The Rise of Monasticism. This subhead is Pre-Monastic Christian Asceticism. Although it has been prominent in the churches in which the majority of Christians have been enrolled, monasticism was unknown in the first 2 centuries of Christianity. Later generations believed that they found commands and precedent for the ascetic life in the teachings and example of Jesus and in other writings of the New Testament, but the accuracy of their interpretation is at least open to question. To be sure, Jesus declared that he who would become his disciple must surrender all that he had. In one notable instance, commanded a wealthy young man to sell all he possessed and give to the poor, and by saying that, there were some who had made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake, appeared to command celibacy. Let me read that sentence again. There were some who had made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake, and that saying appeared to commend celibacy. Yet in marked contrast with John the Baptist, who was clearly an ascetic, Jesus, as he himself remarked, came both eating and drinking, and neither he nor his disciples fasted during his lifetime. His leading disciple Peter, and some others of the apostles, even after the resurrection, continued to live with their wives. Paul, who favored celibacy, knew of no express command from Jesus to support him in it, and said in effect that matrimony might be as much a gift of God as the unmarried state. While community of goods was practiced for a time in the early days of the original Christian church in Jerusalem, the giving of one's possessions to the common store was voluntary and not compulsory, and from the very beginning, private ownership of property seems to have been normal among Christians. In at least one place in the New Testament, those who forbade Christians to marry and commanded them to abstain from some kinds of food were deemed untrue to the faith. While widows were accorded special recognition, no one was enrolled as such before 60 years of age, and the younger widows were commanded to marry and rear children. However, long before monasticism, and indeed from the first days of the church, fasting was an accepted discipline. Widows who did not remarry and who devoted themselves to prayer and the service of the church became customary. Moreover, celibacy was early prized by the church. The shepherd of Hermas held that while it was not wrong for Christian widows or widowers to remarry, they would gain greater honor and glory of the Lord if they refrained from doing so. The shepherd of Hermas, by the way, is written sometime, in all probability, before 160 A.D. As we have seen, the Marcionites forbade marriage, while the Catholic Church did not have that requirement for membership. In 305, a synod in Elvira, in Spain, demanded celibacy of the bishops and other clergy. Even earlier, the custom had been established that a bishop, a priest, or a deacon should not marry if he had been unmarried before his ordination, and that if his wife died, there was to be no remarriage. The official decrees of synods, councils, and popes enjoining celibacy on the clergy seem to have arisen out of a growing custom, and to have reinforced it rather than to have initiated it. Gradually the tradition was developing, which was later to become fixed in the West for the celibacy of deacons, priests, and bishops, and in the East celibacy for the bishops, priests, and deacons. Not far from the middle of the 5th century, Pope Leo the Great extended to subdeacons the rule of clerical celibacy. In the second half of the 4th century, a council in the East condemned those who were regarded as unlawful receiving the Eucharist from the hands of a married priest. Late in the 7th century, in 692, a council which was esteemed ecumenical by the Eastern but not by the Western section of the Catholic Church, declared that any who wished might be married before ordination as subdeacon, deacon, or priest, but no one should do so after ordination, and a married man who was raised to the episcopate must separate from his wife and provide for her in a monastery. The beginning of monasticism. These trends in Christianity prepared a fertile seedbed for monasticism. On the one hand, the level of the morality of the average Christian appeared to be sinking, and the ardent, their consciences quickened by the high standards of the New Testament, were not content with this. On the other hand, Christians had long honored, and many of them had practiced voluntary poverty, or fasting, and celibacy. But why should it have been monasticism rather than other forms of asceticism which arose and flourished on this soil? It was in the 3rd century and in Egypt that monasticism sprang up on the ground so prepared. Attempts have been made to find its source in Indian, Greek, pagan, Egyptian, or Jewish roots, but none of these have been supported by conclusive proof. Indeed, from the outset, Christian monasticism has differed markedly from any previous asceticism or religious community. It seems probable that the impulse which led to its emergence was predominantly and perhaps entirely from the gospel. Origen, a native of Alexandria, gave an example of extreme asceticism in self-mutilation and in austerity in food, drink, sleep, bodily comforts, and he had a profound influence upon many of his pupils, who became prominent in the church in Egypt. Ascetic Gnostics, Marcionites, and Montanists were found in Egypt and may have contributed to the later developments. Yes, yet factors other than those of Christian provenance may have been responsible for the birth of monasticism in Egypt, rather than in some other land. Mysticism and the contemplative life were in non-Christian circles in Egypt, including the Neo-Platonism which had its origin there, and they may have stimulated that phase of the monastic life. It is possible that influences may have entered from India. Manichaeism may have contributed, although probably, if at all, later. Political and economic disorders in Egypt in the 3rd and 4th centuries may have bred a sense of insecurity, which impelled many to seek escape from the world. It is conceivable that a desire to be rid of the growing burden of civic obligations contributed to the flight of some from ordinary society. Probably, too, monasteries arose in part from disgust with city life, with its dust, crowds, noise, and moral corruption. That motive certainly made a strong appeal to some in other lands when the monastic movement had spread to them. The geography and climate of Egypt favored the life of the monk, whether solitary or in community. The fertile valley of the Nile was a ribbon flanked on either side by the desert. Rain was infrequent, and the ascetic could live alone and with little shelter, with such slight food as he needed from villages near at hand or raised on his own little plot of ground. Before the 3rd century was out, Christian hermits were beginning to be seen in Egypt. Some of these had fled to the desert to escape the Decian persecution and remained there after it was over. Others, probably more numerous, began living in solitude as ascetics near villages in huts built by themselves, and there gave themselves to prayer and contemplation. More to be said on monasticism next time. I'll put in a link to Jacques Ellul on the subversion of Christianity.